Good evening, all. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Bill Gettler. I'm an associate dean here at Yale Divinity School, and this is one in an ongoing series of conversations related to our Transformational Leadership program. So we're very glad that you're here. We're going to talk together for about an hour, and then there's obviously a reception. So we hope that you'll stay for that good food and drink, and we'll talk a bit longer than that. Our format is that I'm going to ask a few questions of Nora and Vincent, and then turn to you all. So as they talk, if you'd frame your own questions and think about what you'd like to ask them, then you'll have that chance. I do want to say that this evening marks the first Shabbat since the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre last weekend, and Jewish communities around the country invited all Americans in, and this was an important night for people to be together. So we acknowledge, we grieve, and we too are together tonight. So we're glad that you're here. Nora Gallagher is a writer of memoir and fiction and essay. Her most recent book, Moonlight Sonata at the Mayo Clinic, is a memoir that explores her experience with a baffling affliction, poised to take her sight. A map of illness and uncertainty and faith that is both meditative and highly relatable for anyone who's experienced life-threatening illness or supported a loved one who has. Nora's novel, Changing Light, was chosen by the Times as an editor's choice. Nora wrote as a stringer for Time magazine, I love this part, covering the Patty Hearst trial and the Moscone and Milk assassinations and Dan White trial and subsequent riots and the AIDS crisis. She's written about Prague just after the Velvet Revolution, Nicaragua during the Sandinista regime. Her work has appeared in many publications, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Utne Reader and the Village Voice and Mother Jones and the Los Angeles Times. She's a preacher in residence at Trinity Episcopal Church in Santa Barbara. She's preached nationwide and has taught writing workshops here at YDS, where she is also a member of the Yale Divinity School Advisory Board. Welcome to you, Nora. Vincent Stanley, I have to begin with a quote from your book. Patagonia was to be our irresponsible company, bringing in easy money and a softer life. But it slowly dawned on the small group of climbers and surfers behind the company that they owed big responsibility to nature that they loved. Vincent has been with Patagonia off and on since 1973, for many of those years in key executive roles as head of sales and marketing. More informally, he's Patagonia's longtime chief storyteller, director of philosophy. You have quite a long range of other titles along the way. I love that. Vincent helped develop the Footprint Chronicles, the company's interactive website that outlines the social and environmental impact of its products. He's a visiting fellow at the School of Management here at Yale, and also a poet whose work has appeared in Best American Poetry. We're so glad that you're both with us tonight. So is the story from your book true, that you thought Patagonia would be irresponsible and easy money? Or did Patagonia begin as a socially responsible and environmentally conscious company? What's the truth? Oh, yeah.
No, it's true. We started out, Yvon started out manufacturing climbing equipment from the time he was 17, first in his parents' backyard, and then, can you hear? No? We okay?
Yeah, we're good.
I'm going to move this up a tad. He started out making climbing equipment mostly for himself and his friends. They were doing these routes in Yosemite, very long walls, 3,000, 5,000 feet, that had never been climbed before. And all of the gear was imported from Europe, and it wasn't really suitable for the kind of climbing they were doing. So when he was still a teenager, he was 17, he borrowed $800 from his parents, got a book on blacksmithing out of the Burbank Library, bought a used coal-fired drop forge, and started making the gear. And after 15 years in business, he had a reputation. When I started there, it was mostly just the climbing equipment company. We had a reputation for making the best gear in the world, but we had a net profit of about 1%. I think we probably had maybe 70% of the world's market. But the climbing community was that small that there was just not enough money in it. Yvon's best friend was Doug Tompkins, who later went on to buy 2 million acres in Chile and Argentina and turn them into parks. But the first thing he did was he managed his wife's business, which grew into Esprit. So he had all the connections in the Orient on how to make sportswear. And he kept telling Yvon, this is a piece of cake, you know. You shouldn't work so hard. You get into the clothing business, it's a breeze. You know, you'll be able to buy your sailboat when you turn 40, go to Tahiti and say goodbye to everything. So that was the idea of getting into clothing. And it didn't work that way. And I think partly because we carried the habits from the climbing equipment company into the clothing business. And in climbing, it's not a matter of making good, better, or best, because your life depends on the quality of the gear, and your customers' lives depend on the quality of the gear you're making for them. So that habit came into the company.
But still, you know, I think at the very beginning, this idea of the clothing company, we cared about the environment. We cared about the rocks and climbing and wilderness, but we never gave a thought to the supply chain. We never gave a thought. It wasn't until the 90s, which is a long time after the company had started.
So 20 years later.
So 20 years. And what I was thinking about earlier today was how, when we talked about it this afternoon in the class, that it was as if it was hidden. You know, this entire world of the supply chain was sort of off in the shadows somewhere. And not only did we not investigate it, we didn't even think about it.
So companies were not thinking about it because it's expensive to think about.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's actually a very good point. It is very expensive to think about it and then to do something about it. It's very expensive. But I'm not sure. I somehow think that it's almost a function, as we were saying this afternoon, of capitalism, that certain things are hidden.
Yeah.
And that we don't, psychologically, we just don't think about them until someone, and in this case it was Kathy Gifford's disaster
All right.
with children.
Ah.
It's also true that when in the 70s, when businesses looked at environmental problems, that was something you expected the government to deal with.
Right.
There really was no thought yet in business about looking within and saying, okay, how can we improve our practices? I remember conversations with the head of sourcing for Patagonia, who is a wonderful guy, who's still a friend. Maybe I'll...
You're okay, they'll just turn it down a little, I think.
Is that going to work?
Thank you, yeah, that seems good.
Okay. So I remember talking to the head of sourcing, and not very, I think in the late 70s. And I said, you know, what are the conditions in the factories where we make our stuff? What is it like for the workers? And he says, well, I don't really know. He said, I don't have time to go to the factory floor. And he said, the only thing I can think of is that you really can't make a good product in a bad factory. In other words, the factory has to be reasonably clean. It has to, if they care about the quality of the sewing and the work, they're also going to be a factory that treats its workers well. And I didn't think that was very persuasive. Yeah, and he and I would banter back and forth about that. But it would be another 15 years before we actually, and before it was the Kathy Lee Gifford crisis that actually brought to the attention of the American public, because this was a celebrity who made clothing under license that was sold at Walmart. An NGO exposed that it was being sewn by children. Created quite a ruckus, created a boycott movement in colleges. It was the first time that issue was really raised in public. President Clinton convened a commission. We were part of that. But we were really kind of driven into looking at labor practices by that distant event with Kathy Lee Gifford. But then we started to look internally and do our own work too.
Was there a sense of sacrifice in that, or urgency, or?
Urgency.
Urgency.
And I think it was also, oh, you know what? Look at this. Well, no, it's not true that you can't make good clothes in a bad factory. That's not a priori true. You really have to go in and look at what's going on and then make changes.
So would there have been a sense that there's a moral voice that must be a part of leadership in a company like this?
Yeah.
Was there that language, or was it
No, it was
more
always
utilitarian?
there. It was always there.
Huh.
It's interesting. I mean, in some ways, the moral voice that we've now come to adopt as a sort of moral purpose is best exemplified, I think, by what Yvonne said when this started. This whole question of, we actually started looking at cotton and polyester, and the question was, which is worse for the environment? And we thought polyester, of course, because it's made from oil. But it turned out to be conventional cotton because of pesticides worldwide. Huge, huge market. Cotton was, as you know, the first global market, the thing that created global capitalism. So Yvonne said, you know, if we open that door, we're never going to be able to close it. And that's a kind of moral purpose. You know, it's, if you walk through that door of investigating these two fabrics, you have opened the door that is never going to close. And you're going to have to keep walking through the next door, which is about, well, what about the people on the factory floor? And then what about the dyes in the water? And then what about, he said, you know, this is going to be a pain in the ass.
Quite a prophet,
right.
huh?
But,
yeah.
you know, it was like, well, we have to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it cost us a lot.
Yeah.
When we had to switch to organic cotton in 18 months. But he said, oh, well, we know what's right now. What can we do?
The other thing that made a difference is we would act when we knew we could do something differently. So in the case of cotton, when we learned how harmful the chemicals were in the fertilizers and the pesticides, the next question was, is there an alternative? And there was an alternative because organic cotton was still being grown in China and Texas and Turkey and California. There are other situations where right now we're in the process of examining how do we get out of using fossil fuels as a feedstock for nylon and polyester. Well, that's not so easily resolved. Mm-hmm. That will take a lot of time. So, but I think that's been a critical element in our thinking about when we can make a change and when perhaps we have to back off because we don't know how to make the change, or we participate in an industrial system that has not yet developed an alternative.
Yeah, that's one of the real questions, Bill, is how are we going to create the next economy, which is based on renewables, and when can we simply not do it? So we started calling it the daily dilemma at one point, which arose out of, we trying for a long, long time to look for waterproof coating on jackets that was not made from really nasty chemicals. So Dow Chemical came to us about 15 years ago and they said, we've got it, it's made of corn. We said, fantastic, that's fantastic. And then the head of environmental said, where does the corn come from? And they said, we don't know. And she said, is it GMO? And they said, we don't know. Why should we know? And she said, well, you need to find out. And they said, we can't find out. It's like, corn. So then we had to face that question, and we finally decided no. Wasn't fun, that decision.
Yeah. We talked a little bit in class, we just began a conversation about private-owned versus publicly owned corporations. Yeah. And the Patagonia is privately owned. Maybe just talk a little bit about the flexibility that offers and the challenge for publicly owned. I know that could be the next 3 weeks, but.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that a few people realize there are about 3,700 publicly traded companies in the United States and any number of thousands of privately held businesses. Mm-hmm. Publicly traded business is really limited to pretty large businesses. Someone told me it takes $2 million in overhead just to file the SEC papers every year for a traded company. So Patagonia, because it's owned by the Chenard family, has an awful lot of leeway to innovate and to undertake decisions that would look like risks to publicly traded companies. But on the other hand, we came up with this mission statement 27 years ago. Build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. That third part has been a critical role of the company since 1991. There was a time before that where the Chenards were thinking of selling because they thought, why do we want to be in this, this is a pain to own a company and it's a big deal. Why don't we just sell it all and then we'll give all the money to environmental causes. And they kept the company because they wanted to create something that could be an example for other businesses. So it's been important to us not only to do the environmental and social justice work that we do, but also to be profitable as a business, to succeed as a business in a way that other businesses understand, which we have been, and more so in the past few years. So publicly traded companies, when Emmanuel Faber, who's we talked about this in class, the chairman of Danone, when he saw our ad in 2011 on Black Friday, "Don't buy this jacket," it inspired him. He said, because it was the first time he saw that you could appeal to customers on the basis of values as well as to instincts. And it inspired him enough that he's trying to make his 26 billion euro company a B Corp.
Which would be the first publicly held B Corp in the world. Of
that size, yeah.
B Corp meaning?
A benefit corporation.
And that would mean what?
Sorry. A benefit corporation.
It's a company that has B Corps write their most closely held values into the Articles of Incorporation in the Business Charter. They also submit every 2 years to a third-party holistic assessment of their practices. B Lab, which monitors our practices, has something called the B Impact Assessment Report, to which we now submit every year. And it talks about our impact on our employees, the communities we operate in, our customers, evaluates our governance practices, and also our environmental effect. And this is a movement now of 2,600 companies around the world. There are 34 states that recognize benefit corporations as a separate legal entity.
Is that viable?
Yeah, it has been.
Works, right?
It's a lot more viable than we thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
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 It is, and there's evidence now that B Corp startups are more successful than the average startup. And I think that comes about from companies that are looking holistically at their practices, and particularly at governance from the start.
Mm-hmm.
So they know what they're doing, as opposed to some businesses that might be started either on a whim or started just with the idea, oh, we're going to make a killing in a year and a half, we've got a patent, we're going to get going, then we're going to sell. Your business might fail on all kinds of lines because you're not really in it for the long term.
Mm-hmm. What's radical transparency about? What's that mean in this world?
Yeah, it isn't in the title, isn't it? What radical transparency has come to mean at Patagonia is, again, this sort of question of taking one step and then taking another step, which is that in the very beginning of when I started working at Patagonia, which was as a catalog editor, I wrote a lot of product copy. And I remember I used journalist techniques because I had a journalism background. And so I interviewed the people who designed and made the products, or who designed and made the samples of the products. And I wrote a jacket copy, and the head of marketing came to me and said, "You seem to be telling the truth." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I guess it's okay." And nobody was intentionally lying at Patagonia at that time, and there was a kind of bias towards being straightforward and simple, which came from the climbing equipment copy. But that sort of gradually became a way of writing and speaking and talking to the customer. But it wasn't really until Don't Buy This Jacket that we saw the full reach of radical transparency. And Don't Buy This Jacket, for those of you who didn't see this ad, was in the New York Times full page on Black Friday. And it basically said, pictured one of our famous jackets and said, "Don't buy this jacket." And then it talked about the environmental footprint of that jacket, which is pretty bad. And this is a responsible jacket. And the first thing that happened was that I loved. Many things happened after that ad, but the first thing that I heard about was my boss, who's the head of the environmental department, was back in Connecticut visiting her family. And it's a knock on the door at like 8 in the morning on the day after Thanksgiving. And she opened the door. And it's the neighbor, fairly conservative guy. She was a little worried. He had the ad in his hand. She thought, oh, shit. And he said, "I just want to thank you for doing this." And she said, "Come in." And he said, "I want to thank you for doing this because I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've been thinking about consumption. I've been thinking about the environment. I've been thinking about making clothes and manufacturing. I've been thinking about all this stuff, and you have put it into words for me." And when I heard that story, I thought, "You have put it into words for me" is a way of building a community of people that care about what happens to the environment in manufacturing. And that's where radical transparency can take you.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you.
It's also, it was interesting when we created the Footprint Chronicles. We at first took five different products, and we analyzed them from the cotton field or the oil well all the way to the warehouse shelf. And the way we looked at it, we for each product we said, okay, we had the good, the bad, and what we think. And on the good, we talked about what we were proud of about the product, and the bad, we talked about what we weren't so proud of and what we hadn't been able to change. And what we think, we talked about, this is where we need to go next. So we produced this, and this was to replace, in place of a CSR report. Because I wrote a CSR report in 2003, and we all went to sleep and buried it. And we didn't, a corporate responsibility report. We didn't want to talk to our customers that way. So the Footprint Chronicles was intended for our customers and also for interested NGOs. But the interesting thing about it was that it made a huge difference to the employees. And it made a huge difference to the employees because for the first time, employees understood what we were proud of, what we weren't so proud of, and what we thought we needed to do. And it raised the level of conversation and debate in the company about what we should do environmentally and socially with our products. It was a big surprise, and eventually it also affected our suppliers. So that kind of transparency of putting it on the page and people being able to think, it's really key, especially when you're dealing with supply chains that are so blind and so willfully blind. When you bring things into the open, you have the opportunity to make changes.
Nora, you've been writing a bit about climate change. When will issues of climate change start to matter in business?
Now, and yesterday, and absolutely now. There's no question that we are well beyond the point where a business can ignore this problem and hope to exist. I think one of the things that we discovered recently in Patagonia was just that we had the results of climate change come at us in December last year. I'm sure you've heard about the wildfires in California. I ended up writing an essay about it. One of the things that I felt while this wildfire was building in 7 cities in Southern California, burning from Ventura, where the Patagonia headquarters are, where 70% of our people were evacuated, going up the coast all the way to Santa Barbara, where we live and where there are 80 people who work for Patagonia. One of the things I thought about was this sort of sense of dread that was building, and I thought at first it was the fire, which of course it was. But then I realized later that it was something much larger than that. And it really was this feeling of this is what climate change looks like right now, right here. So one of the things we just realized, and we'd been planning for climate change for some time at Patagonia, we realized that we had to accelerate that planning. We're now planning on being carbon neutral as fast as we can, because once you've experienced the effects of climate change in your life, you also realize that it will happen everywhere, that none of us will be spared from this, that it will not happen tomorrow, it will not happen someplace else, which is what we keep thinking. You know, climate deniers, climate believers, we all think it's going to happen somewhere else. It's not going to happen somewhere else. It happened twice to us, in December and January, and we got the picture.
Are there connections between the kinds of work and learning that you've been doing at Patagonia and the faith communities that you know, the congregations where you've preached or teach?
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, because the night of what followed the fire in Santa Barbara was an extraordinary mudslide, and mudslide doesn't really give you the full picture. It was, they call it a debris flow. They had an intense amount of rain on the hillside that had recently been scoured by the fire. And boulders half the size of this room came down from the mountain and knocked over houses, and whole neighborhoods were destroyed and buried in mud. I have never seen such a devastated landscape. And that night, at the very foot of this whole mess, there's an Episcopal church, All Saints by the Sea, a wealthy and beautiful parish And the rector was up all night, and at about 2 in the morning, she said to her wife, you know, I think we should go down and light up the church. All the power was out. And so they went down and they lit all the candles they could light in the church. And she said, you know, it will just be a place where people can come. And it turned out to be one of the few places where people could actually get to, who had either been stuck in their cars or were desperately trying to get away from their neighborhoods or for walking out. And so then they became a staging area for emergency crews, and eventually a staging area for people who had to be evacuated by helicopter. So I think overnight, they turned into what I would call a resilient community. And what's interesting to me now is, so what is it like 6 months, 9 months later?
Right.
And I've just sent the rector a long email asking her exactly what parts of the church have changed. But one of the things that they said was they joined with other groups in the community, like what was called the Bucket Brigade, which was a group of volunteers who were digging people out of their houses. You understand, their houses were full of mud. So they joined with that, so now they have a partnership with an NGO. They really saw how valuable they were the night of the mudslide. And they're now planning ahead for the next one. So I don't know, and I'm really interested to know how it may have changed their practice of faith. I would like to know that, and how do they talk about climate change? So there are a lot of questions about that I still don't know. But I think that it provided for them certainly a purpose that night, and I think a direction to go. So, see.
What questions do you have for Vincent, for Nora? Yes.
So, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us. Great conversation. And so, less than a week ago, Brazil elected a far-right president, and this is part of the same conservative trend that the U.S. experienced 2 years ago. And I think one of the main outcomes of this election was that it made the whole country very polarized. That suddenly you end up seeing a lot of extreme conservative ideas on a lot of people that probably were not expressing that before. So it became very evident that that was a big trend, just like here in the U.S. So I would love to hear more about how was to be a company that was talking about the environment and about all of these social concerns in a world that is turning to be very conservative.
Did you hear that?
I don't know exactly. It's true that all around the world, people are electing strong men as leaders, which I tend to think indicates a symptom of collapse in the regular order. That it's an indication that things are not working well, and people who lose confidence then vote for a strong man because they think, okay, this person is going to go ahead and take care of things because none of the democratic processes are going to work. One of the things that happened to us as a company during the George Bush administration, which was not an environmentally friendly administration, was that we doubled down on regional and local environmental efforts, and that we worked very strongly with allies where we could find them. And since the Trump administration came in, of course, we have sued the government over Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, but we've also we realized after the election, we can't fall asleep. The government is not going to be a source of help for us. We're going to have to work very hard, and we're going to have to work very hard with our alliances, and we're going to have to make friends, and we're going to have to do this work so that when the time comes and the Trumps and the Orbans and the Modis and I've forgotten his name, is gone, there is something strong in the world that people can ally with and participate in. So
I think that it turned us, not only did we have an activist base, the people we give 1% to, who are grassroots environmentalists, but also we became an activist company. We suddenly took on the front lines. We'd been in the back seat, giving money to people who were in the front, and all of a sudden we were in the front. Our lawyer was filing the lawsuit papers as the fire was coming over the hillside to her office in December last year. It took us a while to figure out, and as I think it took a lot of people a while to figure out how to be the resistance, but also how to talk to people about the value of public lands, that this is something that American citizens hold in common. So I think that we wanted to do both things. We wanted to resist, and we wanted to talk about how incredibly valuable these lands are. So you want to make sure that you stand by the things that you love, and don't let the strongmen come and knock them down just for kicks.
And the other important thing, and I don't know how you do this, but we need, environmentalists, not necessarily Patagonia, need to learn how to talk to people who don't share our background and don't share our passions, who aren't necessarily going to be supporting Trump forever. Timothy Snyder, who teaches history at Yale and is really an expert on the end of World War II, I heard him talk the other day, and he said, you know, the same people who were running the bureaucracy in Nazi Germany created the Federal Republic. It was the same people, and which is one of the strongest democracies in Europe. And so how do you kind of separate the threads there and make sure that while you're in the process of fighting your enemies, you make more friends who you might assume were enemies?
Mm-hmm. Others? Grace?
So, you talked about how Patagonia is a B Corp and privately owned, but do you see any hope for corporate social responsibility in this shareholder capitalism we find ourselves in? It doesn't seem like the CEOs are only accountable to their shareholders. They have no incentive for social responsibility. So I know that's a different world than you're in, but I just wonder if you take on that.
We talked about this. Nora talked about it. It's been a bias in business since 1971. Famous article by Milton Friedman saying, "Don't be good guys. The sole purpose of a corporation is to maximize profits for its shareholders," and that has since been interpreted as the primary product that a company has is its stock price, and everything else is kind of less important. So that model as a business, though, is not working out so well for businesses, as well as for people and for the planet, because it's such a short-term view of business. The businesses then become vulnerable to longer-term effects. And one of those longer-term effects, two of them, are social unrest and environmental crisis. So I think on two fronts, this is kind of an interpretation. I could be very wrong, but my sense is that the circumstances will force businesses, forces from consumers, from legislators, and just from simple events to change their behavior. And then the second thing is within the supply chain, it really will become the absolute responsibility of businesses to clean up their act, because they're going to be we're going to be short on resources. Things are going to get expensive. Things are going to get disrupted. And in order for businesses to deal with that, they have to change their behavior in order to become flexible, resilient. To become flexible and resilient, you have to be responsive to human beings. And human beings, when they start to act with moral purpose, also care about their environment.
One of the examples we used in the class today was the large corporation publicly held of Danone, which is French and I think a 25 billion euro publicly held company. And Emmanuel Faber, who's the CEO, said he wanted to have all of his subsidiaries be benefit corporations in the United States. So they did that. And when they did that, he got a call from one of his banks. All corporations have huge loans from the financial industry to keep doing business. And the bank said, we want to tell you that we're going to lower your interest rate. And he said, excuse me. And they said, it's because you've decided that all these subsidiaries are going to be benefit corporations. And we think that that's because you are taking in the element of risk. So you're calculating your risk. And if you're doing that, you're doing good business. So you're likely to be in business for a longer stretch of time. This interests us, and we want you to stay in business. So that is a huge move, a shift within the financial world, which is a very conservative world. So he wants to take his entire publicly held corporation to benefit status. It's going to be very interesting if he does that.
If you were starting up again, what mistakes would you avoid? What do you know now you didn't know then?
Oh, lots of things.
Yeah, I know. But which ones that are going to be helpful to people who are heading out into...
Well, Ivo and I used to sit down and talk, and we said, if we started business now instead of in the 70s, we would have been goners.
That's not helpful.
The world's a lot less forgiving. Yeah. I think making the mistakes I made as a leader in a company would be that I really wasn't consistent about consulting all of the people who might be affected by a particular decision. Mm. And so there were initiatives I pushed that failed, I think, because, partly because they weren't well thought out, but also because I hadn't dealt with all the potential stakeholders. And I think also, I'll tell you one funny story about it. I used to run the sales force, and we, as companies do, the sales people, when they started out, they were living in the back of their vans, and they were making $12 a year selling our clothes, and it was, and then they started to get rich in the 70s. And pretty soon, my Northeast rep was wearing alligator shoes, So I thought, well, maybe we're paying these guys too much. And so we took them off commission and paid them a regular salary. But in order to do this, I concocted this elaborate bonus scheme that was, based on how many times they clinicked the retail floor people, how well the store was merchandised. I mean, I put everything into this about what do I want these guys to be doing. I gave them points. And it was very hard to maintain. But I remember one year my Texas rep aced it. He got 100% bonus. And so I was talking to him on the phone. I said, Mike, you did a fantastic job this year. And he said, I did the same job I do every year. And that really struck me, because I think that you think in business about money being the motivator. And you think about you're trying to create incentives so that people will act in a certain way. But in effect, I think human motivation really runs down a different stream. And it runs down a different stream in business as in any other activity.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
Mm.
I think I would have been bolder, much braver in the decisions that I made. I think that one of the reasons that Yvon is a kind of visionary is that he's very brave. And when we published Don't Buy This Jacket, I argued against it.
Huh.
I said, you can't do that. It's really dangerous. You're going to be telling them exactly what the carbon footprint is. That's not a good idea. And he
I
said,
wrote it.
You know, it's partly because he wrote it. But yeah, and you know, when I saw it and saw what it did, I, of course, was completely wrong. But I think that it's good to be brave.
Mm.
It's good to step out.
In the back, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question, and I know Patagonia has a very high reputation for being like a good quality company, and it appeals to sort of a niche market who values the same values and can also afford the products. And so I'm wondering, is Patagonia doing anything now or in the future to try to reach a broader base of people, say a voter base, who won't ever be able to afford the clothing necessarily, but you still want to sort of impart those values?
It's a hard question for us, but I think one of the things that's happened with clothing is much cheaper than it was 40 years ago. But the inexpensiveness of clothing has really come at the expense of the environment and especially of labor. So one of the things we think about is how do you change the perception of clothing? Yeah. And so that's why we've been arguing for higher quality clothes, fewer of them. That's why we did Don't Buy This Jacket. We said, listen, this is a terrific product environmentally compared to everything else we do, and yet everything that we do making this piece of clothing costs the planet more than we know how to repay. So one of the things, we created a very strong repair program, encouraging people to repair clothes. Durability has been key to, has been a key element to our business strategy forever. And we've also started to conduct a worn wear campaign of trying to, of selling used clothes. And I think that that's, for us, that becomes an entry for people who can not afford their clothes as much. We're also making a workwear line that we sell only directly to avoid some of the margin requirements of selling through other stores. But that's been our approach rather than to try to come up with a lower quality line or relax some of our standards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how you feel that the cultural environment of the 60s and 70s affected you towards the beginning of the endeavor, and whether you feel like you've changed a lot since that time in terms of your ideas about social justice, and also how you think that those ideas might apply to current social justice and cultural movements.
Yes, is the answer. I mean, there have been I think what's very interesting, if you go back and look at the early Patagonia catalogs in, say, 73, you see how much the environmental movement is affecting the way that we were doing business then in the climbing community. We're talking about the value of mountains. We're talking about the value of wildness, protection of the world. It's very clear that the climbers who were writing for the catalogs, and when we realized that our equipment was destroying the rock, then all of that was about the environmental movement. I think, like many members of the environmental movement, we totally forgot about people in the midst of it. And you probably remember deep ecology that entered into that whole thing. Our friend Doug Tompkins was very much involved in deep ecology. And deep ecology really had a kind of anti-human bias. I mean, it was a pretty kind of interesting deeply passionate and a little scary. And there was, I remember those conversations around the Chenard table and with Doug, and I drew back from it because of my bias towards human beings, but still I could see that people who were deeply involved in protecting the environment were just horrified by what was going on in the world. They were seeing what they loved completely destroyed. It took us a long time, and I think part of it was the supply chain work, to suddenly look at the fact that environmental degradation happens to poor communities faster than anywhere else. And that finally knitted together for us the question of social justice and environmental justice. That's what finally penetrated what was a fairly classic environmental stance. And now I feel that the environmental department that I'm part of is really playing catch up. But that whole sense of social justice now permeates the whole company. I mean, nobody is off of that now. And a lot of it is the question of which groups we support with grassroots donations regarding where they are in relation to environmental degradation, but also how the supply chain and how the people in the supply chain are treated. So there's fair trade and auditing and so forth. So now it's front and center, but it wasn't for a long time.
We treated our own employees well, but then what happened in the supply chain was only gradually became visible. And we undertook efforts to make it visible.
This question sparked my own curiosity in Patagonia. The climbing and just outdoor industry overall has been incredibly masculine dominated and macho dominated for a very long time, since back in the 70s. And just in light of women equality, white women making 71 cents to the nearest dollar, and the Me Too movement, I'm wondering what the progression was for Patagonia within that process, and where you are today as far as activism. It's not necessarily directly environmental, but certainly talking about your workers' rights, if that comes in women, girls.
Yeah. Well, we've been conscious for a long time. I mean, we within the sports we make clothes for, we've had women ambassadors. The balance of executives is something like 80% women vice presidents. All of that, I think where we fall short more is on issues of people of color represented in the catalogs or represented in the image or represented as employees. It's still, there's a ways to go, but we also have a book division. So we promoted books by Belinda Baggs and I'm blanking on the name of this amazing sailor. But we really have kind of put that experience front and center, that the experience of women who are out in nature. You might.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that actually with women climbers, we've been pretty equal all the way across, because women have been involved in climbing for a good long stretch. There weren't so many women in the 70s when climbing became such a popular sport and better known than it was before. But as soon as it began to spread, Patagonia supported women climbers. We supported Lynn Hill and various other women, Mariah Craner, various women climbers who were the best women and some of the best climbers in the world. So that was really, it was interesting. I don't think it was a question for giving support. It was a question of recognizing excellence in any kind of athlete. And that's been pretty true, I've noticed, across the board with skiers, trail runners. All of our so-called ambassadors are pretty equal in terms of sexes. And then at Patagonia, because we have daycare in the company from the beginning, from babyhood up, we retain women, of course, much longer. And so our, at least 60% of the employees are women and very high-level executives, including our CEO. So that has not been as difficult a problem for us, but the question of people of color is a big question because, and of course, in the environmental movement, there's a very low. There's not as strong a representation, and so we definitely look at social justice as that way of extending our reach and getting to know that community. The environmental movement has been justly criticized for its white makeup, and that's who we are.
So what's it like to be so close to a company that's such an icon, that is so recognizable, that lots of famous people wear those vests? And is there a part of, and what's the role of your own moral leadership in the midst of that, as you see other companies, other leaders, really keeping a close eye on what you're doing? I don't think those two are unrelated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think.
You're the cool kid, so what's that like?
Yeah, being a cool kid. Well, you're afraid somebody else is going to become cooler than
right.
you are.
Which could happen.
I remember when we had Donald Rumsfeld was wearing a Patagonia vest on the cover of his book, and we're going,
can't win them all.
But initially, I think when I wrote this book, The Responsible Company with Yvonne, that came out and was launched here, the forestry and the business schools in 2012.
Makeup, yeah.
And I started speaking and going around. I remember there was one, Nora and I went, the book was translated into Bulgarian. And I got this email saying, we want to translate it into Bulgarian, and we're going to give you a royalty of $250 or something. I said, great, and signed it off. So Nora and I were traveling to Istanbul, and I thought, well, I wonder what's happening with that book in Bulgaria. So I couldn't find anything in the website. There's one of those things with you have 400 characters to write a little note. And I said, I think we could possibly come through. What's happening with the book? That I'd never hear from them again. And 20 minutes later, I get an email saying, there's a book launch. We're going to have a party. Come
wow.
to Sofia. So Nora and I took these series of trains, thinking it was very romantic. Well, it was very romantic from Vienna to Budapest. And then Budapest to Bucharest, it got a little more primitive. And then for the last 8 hours of train ride to Sofia, we had no food or water because the Bulgarian train didn't have any, and neither did the stations. They had some wild dogs snapping at the people who were coming off the train. Then we get into Sofia late at night, and this guy who looks like Pigpen from the Grateful Dead greets me, and he's the publisher.
Shorts.
And so I go around with him. I say, how many people do you usually get at a book launch here? Oh, 25, 30. Oh, okay. Where is this event going to be held? Oh, we got the basement of the Ministry of Culture, because a rock band is coming on at 11, and we're going to be there. Free. Oh, okay, fine, thanks. And so show up, and 250 people came.
Wow.
We don't sell in Bulgaria. So that was kind of an indication to me of that our reputation was something that involved a huge sense of responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I've felt that ever since, going around both talking to people and then talking to people internally. And fortunately, that sense of responsibility has also bubbled up a lot more internally, so that when I go and talk to folks, I never feel that I'm pushing things upstream. I feel that I'm actually still representing, not very well, representing a very interesting movement by a very committed group of people.
Yeah, I think that's what was important about the Bulgaria experience, was that we saw that in Eastern Europe, especially, and we'd seen it in Prague as well, that they know communism economy, the state-run economy. They know, and now they know capitalism, and they don't want either one. They want something else. They want something that involves people and enterprise and privacy and all the kinds of ambition, but is something else. And that's why all those people turned out, I think, in Sofia. You could see that they were young and wanted to see something else happening. And so there are many companies like Patagonia. You know, we're not the only cool kids on the block. And they're all trying to figure out how to do this next economy. How to do something that's humane and enterprising and fun. And I think that sense of that global movement that was so apparent in Sofia made us cry. You know, it's a really important thing to watch happening.
Right. And you know, the other thing, you raised the point about the number of corporations who are not very nice and who are acting still on the Milton Friedman basis and still worried about their stock price. But you know, I have now a long memory of 45 years going back with this place, and I remember in 1992 we hired our first environmental manager, and I went out looking for one, and I couldn't find an environmental manager. I couldn't find someone who could do a life cycle analysis in business. I had to go to the city of Irvine to hire our first environmental manager. And now we're talking, every business school worth its salt has a serious sustainability program. Now we're talking 2,600 self-described benefit corporations who are submitting to third-party audits of their practices. So the kind of, you know, we may be the cool kid on the block now, but we used to be the pretty lonely geek on the block. And I feel like we have a lot more company these days.
Yeah.
This is our 20th Transformational Leadership program, and the one that has the most representation from the School of Management and from the Forestry School and from the Divinity School. I think it suggests that kind of confluence, that kind of great excitement about the model that you're offering.
Yeah.
Will you join me in thanking Nora and Vincent?